Today I'll be reviewing the Dominican Republic as a vacation destination and if it's worth your time and money. I've taken 2 trips to the DR. My first was an all-inclusive resort stay celebrating my high school graduation with friends and family and only leaving the resort for 3 to 4 excursions. The second trip was exploring what the country has to offer, staying at an all-inclusive, cheaper resort and other spots but spending less time there. I'm not an expert on the country, these are just my thoughts from my experiences and everything I gathered in my 2 trips. Overall, I think the DR is a very average vacation destination, and I'll go in depth on everything I have included on my score that I'll share at the end. When I was in high school trying to put on weight, eating anything and everything handed to me, I was pretty easy to please, but even at the nice resort, I still thought the food was pretty mediocre, while most of my family and friends thought it was terrible. Coming back as a much more seasoned traveler that can appreciate nicer things, I mostly agreed with everyone else. On the resorts, you primarily get buffets that are rarely fresh tasting and often bland. Off the resorts, we thought some local spots and touristy spots may be better, and they were, but still fairly average. One bonus is it generally isn't very expensive when you're off the resort. Sights and scenery are generally the main reason I travel places, and they do have some exciting things to do. There's history in Santo Domingo as the oldest city in the Americas. There's some great mountain scenery compared to most of the Caribbean, as well as some great beaches and caves scattered around the island. A major con is the extremely dense population on the island, the size of a small state. This, mixed with its history of corruption and poverty, makes most of the country less safe and not very well maintained. Driving into any of their cities is a nightmare, and it makes the sights less worth the effort. This leads me into some day trip excursion recommendations. I'd recommend the 27 Waterfalls of Domagua tour an hour south of Puerto Plata, but only if you're staying there. We came from Santo Domingo and stayed in Santiago, which was about 3 hours of stressful driving all put together. Not to mention our host at our Airbnb didn't even bother to show for our room that night in Santiago, and we had to find a hotel at 10 p.m. Only 7 of the waterfalls were open because of water levels since July of 2022, but that is as far as most of the tour groups go anyway. That tour is 2.5 hours with about 30 minutes in the water, 30 to 45 minutes waiting around, and the rest spent hiking. The hike through the forest wasn't bad, and I will say the 30 minutes in the water made everything worth it. For as many people as they had, it is pretty well organized and you don't feel rushed or crowded when you're in the water. This tour cost an affordable $57, which included lunch for us, and even though it was quite the effort to get there, it was well worth it looking back on it. The second trip I'd recommend is kayaking and caving in Los Haititas National Park. The tour leaves near Sabana del Mar, which is not a resort destination, and it is over 2 hours from Punta Cana, or a couple hours by boat from Samana. The drive along the coast is more scenic than most of the country, but still very slow through the towns. Once you reach the park, after a short ride on a dirt road, you start the tour with kayaking through mangroves. It was a really pretty and unique 4-hour tour, leaving at low tide and coming back at high, and seeing all the birds and critters that roam around. As soon as you felt you've been in the groves long enough, the bay opens up wide and you're in open waters going to the caves. The rocks on the coast are a highlight, as I even had some people in the comments asking me if I was in Thailand. The sea caves at low tide were also very fun to explore, and since we went early in the morning, we had our own guide for our group. I have a link to both of these tours if you want to see more footage and what you can expect. I would recommend stopping at Montana Redonda on the way back for the mountain views and the swing, which we regrettably passed up on the day. They do ask for about $15 to $20 per person just to give you a ride up the hill, but it's more than likely worth it. The last tour I would recommend is a day trip in Santo Domingo. The Zona Colonial is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in the Americas. They have some beautiful, authentic, and historic buildings and sites from the early 1500s, all within walking distance. Driving around the city and finding parking can be tricky depending on the time of day, but once you're there, everything settles down. We didn't get to spend as much time as I'd hoped, and when we had the opportunity to come back, it wasn't really worth the effort to fight traffic in and out of the city and spending most of our time in the car. I recommend coming for a full day, whether by tour group or by car. Tours from Punta Cana I know ran about $70 per person. There are a few museums, really cool churches, and a fort. Also nearby is the Columbus Lighthouse, and a really unique cross-shaped building with an interesting museum and a coffin in the middle that the Dominican government claims holds the remains of Christopher Columbus. Last, the 2 spots closer to the airport are the Three Eyes National Park, that's essentially a large sinkhole with actually 4 small blue lakes in it. This was a super pretty spot right in the middle of the city that was well worth the visit. The other park right next to the airport is San Marino La Cleta, which was a beautiful beach that is supposed to be great for snorkeling with some of the prettiest water we saw in the country and some cool cliffs to go along with it. There are very limited beaches and swimming spots in and around the city. Those are the unique 2 Dominican excursions we did, but on my first trip we also did zip lining and swimming with dolphins, which you can pretty much do anywhere else in the Caribbean. Some sites we didn't see that looked pretty cool were El Limon Waterfall, Cutabanama National Park with Isle Soyona, and some more secluded national parks scattered around the country. Puerto Plata, from my research, also looked like one of the more interesting cities to visit outside of Santo Domingo. Most of the locals we interacted with were not friendly. This is not Jamaica, and you would think that on the resorts that might change, but it was rare to come by people, especially outside of the resorts, that aren't constantly trying to swindle you for tours or parking, and it can get very uncomfortable. Driving in this country was an absolute nightmare. The roads are actually in very good condition, and most of the highways are 2 separate lane roads, but that does not stop the swarm of locals on scooters going the wrong way down the highway and people taking no consideration for the speed limit, which was hard to tell what it even was. We got picked up for going about 6 miles an hour over the speed limit, and they just walk out in the middle of the road and point to the side. But in the end, the officer just wanted us to pay him to avoid a ticket. He spoke no English like a large chunk of the country besides tour operators and hotel managers. If we weren't traveling with someone that spoke fluent Spanish, we would have found ourselves in trouble multiple times. Weather-wise, we visited in May and June on the 2 trips. May was pretty hot and humid, but not unbearable, while June was pretty brutal, and it was a good thing we were by the pool most days. Since it is further south, I've heard it's warmer than places like the Bahamas in the winter. Affordability is also something to consider for the Dominican, as it was significantly cheaper than our trip to the Bahamas and some other countries that I've been to in the past in the Caribbean. Food and accommodations are generally less from what I've seen compared to most of those countries as well, but you tend to get what you pay for some of these. For this last section, most visitors will be staying in a resort when visiting the country, and depending on your budget, you can have very different experiences. As I mentioned, we stayed at 1 higher-end resort and 1 smaller resort on my 2 visits. The food was bad at both, the service was no better, but the rooms and the amenities were fine. There were smaller amenities offered, just obviously better ones at the higher-end resort, like a larger casino, nicer golf course, and more restaurants. They both had a spa, water sports, basketball, and tennis courts. The cheaper place tried to offer free golf and scuba lessons, but in reality, only offered it 1 day a week at a certain time if the trainer was even in on that day. So most activities like golf and spa will come at an additional cost. I clearly had a bad experience with an Airbnb and wouldn't recommend it unless it had extensive reviews and it was at a more touristy destination. The hotel in Santiago we stayed at was fine, but it wasn't much cheaper than a night at the all-inclusive resort we stayed at, and if you plan on drinking, it will be much better bang for your buck. I have some strong opinions about the Dominican Republic, but my first visit was one of the best trips of my life because who I went with, and you can always make the most of your trips that way. There really are some worthwhile activities, history, and sights to see, and some great beaches and scenery, and it's more affordable than most of the Caribbean. There are some major drawbacks that can affect your vacation. I rated the country as a whole a 5 out of 10 with the breakdown shown. I wouldn't recommend visiting this country to people watching or my friends over most destinations, but if it's somewhere you do find yourself visiting or you're on a budget, I hope this video was helpful. It helps you know what to expect, and you can still enjoy your trip. This was just my opinion. You may have a totally different experience, and that's the beauty of traveling. Let me know your thoughts or questions in the comments below.